The fog was thick and grey as Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope stood on the bridge of HMS Glowworm on April 8, 1940, at 8:47 in the morning somewhere in the Norwegian Sea, watching as a massive shape emerged from the murk ahead like a steel cathedral materializing from nothing, revealing itself to be Admiral Hipper, a German heavy cruiser that displaced 14,000 tons and mounted 8-inch guns and 12 torpedo tubes and possessed an armored belt 6 inches thick that made her nearly invulnerable to the weapons available on Roope's destroyer. The size difference between the two vessels was absurd and almost comical if the situation hadn't been so deadly serious, with Hipper outweighing Glowworm by a factor of 10 to 1 and outgunning her by 3 to 1, while being able to absorb punishment that would obliterate the smaller ship in seconds, creating a tactical mismatch so extreme that engagement seemed suicidal under any rational analysis. Roope's destroyer was already damaged from earlier exchanges with German destroyers that had been screening the cruiser, having been hit multiple times with her bridge partially destroyed and her forward gun turret jammed and one boiler room flooded, reducing her speed from the designed maximum of 36 knots down to 28 knots and compromising her fighting capabilities in ways that made the already unfavorable tactical situation even more desperate. He faced 3 options that presented themselves with brutal clarity as he assessed the situation and considered his responsibilities to his crew and his ship and his mission, with those options being to surrender and become prisoners of war, to run and attempt to disengage using smoke and escape into the fog to live to fight another day, or to attack despite the overwhelming odds against success. The rulebook that every Royal Navy officer had studied said clearly that he should run and disengage and use smoke screens and escape into the fog where the larger cruiser couldn't follow effectively, preserving his ship and crew for future operations rather than throwing them away in a hopeless gesture. But Gerard Roope looked at his executive officer and then at the helmsman, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and almost conversational in tone, despite the enormity of what he was about to order. He said simply, "Full ahead, both engines, steer to ram." And the helmsman hesitated for exactly 1 second as the order's implications registered in his mind before spinning the wheel hard over to point Glowworm's bow directly at Hipper's massive hull. The destroyer's bow swung toward the German cruiser as both engines accelerated to maximum power, generating 28 knots, with the range closing rapidly from 2,000 yards to 1,500 to 1,000 as the two vessels approached each other on collision course. The German cruiser saw what was happening, but realized too late to turn away effectively, and found herself too close to avoid the British destroyer, whose captain had made the extraordinary decision to ram, and Hipper's secondary batteries opened fire desperately with 5.9-inch shells, firing 14 rounds in 8 seconds in attempt to stop or disable the attacking destroyer before she could strike. Glowworm's forward superstructure disintegrated under the concentrated fire, and her second gun turret exploded as shells found their mark and fires erupted across the deck. But her bow remained pointed steadily at Hipper's starboard side, despite the devastating damage she was receiving, with Roope maintaining course and speed through sheer determination as his ship absorbed punishment that should have stopped her. The range continued to close through 500 yards and 300 and 100 yards as the two vessels approached each other at combined speed exceeding 50 knots. And then came the impact that would be remembered and analyzed by naval historians for decades. The sound of steel meeting steel at 30 knots was unlike anything else in naval warfare, according to survivors who described it not as an explosion or a crack, but as a scream of metal tearing and rivets shearing and hull plates buckling under forces they were never designed to withstand. Glowworm's bow crumpled like paper as her entire forward section from the stem to the bridge compressed by 40 feet in approximately 2 seconds, with the tremendous kinetic energy having to go somewhere and transferring into Hipper's hull, where it created a 40-meter gash extending from the waterline to the main deck, flooding 3 compartments immediately while severing electrical systems and rupturing steam lines in ways that would require major repair work, for 10 seconds that seemed to last forever. The 2 ships remained locked together with Glowworm's mangled bow embedded in Hipper's side like a parasite attached to its host. And then the destroyer's momentum carried her alongside, grinding and scraping with her starboard side, dragging along Hipper's hull as the cruiser's propellers that were still turning at full power caught Glowworm's stern. The spinning propeller blades chewed through the destroyer's plating and destroyed her rudder and shredded her aft compartments in what amounted to a death blow for the already mortally wounded vessel. And finally, the destroyer broke free and drifted away dead in the water while listing 15 degrees to starboard and burning from stem to stern. Roope gave the order to abandon ship with calm professionalism, despite knowing he was condemning himself and many of his crew to death in the freezing Norwegian Sea. And 4 minutes later, HMS Glowworm rolled over and sank, taking with her the accumulated memories and experiences of 3 years of service since her commissioning in 1937. 109 men went into the water, wearing whatever survival equipment they had managed to grab during the brief evacuation period. And of those 109, only 38 would survive to be rescued and become prisoners of war, with Gerard Roope not being among the survivors despite his heroic leadership during the action. But Roope's story didn't end with his death in those cold waters, because 6 months later, something extraordinary and unprecedented happened that would forever link his name with that of his enemy, when the captain of Admiral Hipper, Helmut High, wrote a letter through the International Red Cross to the British Admiralty recommending that Lieutenant Commander Roope be awarded the Victoria Cross, the sight of an enemy officer recommending Britain's highest military honour for the man who had tried to sink his ship, represented something unprecedented in modern naval warfare, where such gestures of respect across battle lines were extremely rare. And High's letter stated that the action of the commanding officer of HMS Glowworm in engaging a much superior force and sacrificing his ship and his own life in an attempt to ensure the survival of his crew was in accordance with the highest traditions of the Royal Navy and deserving of the greatest recognition. The Victoria Cross was eventually awarded posthumously in July 1945, 5 full years after Roope's death, and only after considerable bureaucratic delay and uncertainty about how to handle such an unusual recommendation from an enemy officer. But the award, when it finally came, recognized courage that transcended national boundaries and acknowledged that certain actions deserve recognition regardless of which side of a conflict performed them. This story encompasses not just the individual heroism of Gerard Roope, but also the larger context of a desperate German gamble to invade Norway, and the British response to that invasion, and how a single destroyer accidentally stumbled into the middle of massive strategic operations while searching for a sailor lost overboard. The context began on April 7, 1940, at 6:00 a.m. in Wilhelmshaven, Germany, when Admiral Hipper slipped her moorings, followed by the entire German surface fleet preparing to sail, including 2 battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with 4 heavy cruisers and 14 destroyers and 38 submarines, all heading toward Norway as part of Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Norway and Denmark that represented the largest amphibious operation Germany had ever attempted. The operation involved 6 simultaneous landings across 1,000 miles of coastline in what was an audacious and arguably insane plan, given that Germany had no tradition of amphibious warfare and no specialized landing craft, and no marine infantry, requiring them to improvise everything while relying on surprise and speed and the Kriegsmarine's entire surface fleet to provide fire support and transport. Admiral Hipper's specific mission involved escorting Group 2 to Trondheim, consisting of 4 destroyers carrying 1,700 mountain troops in vessels that were overloaded, with each destroyer carrying twice their normal complement, and having soldiers crammed into every available space, with weapons stacked on deck in configurations that compromised the ship's fighting capabilities. The transit would require 40 hours through the North Sea, past the Shetland Islands, and into the Norwegian Sea, while avoiding British patrols that would certainly be looking for unusual naval movements given the increasing tensions between Britain and Germany. Captain Helmut High, who commanded Admiral Hipper, was 42 years old and a professional naval officer who was competent and experienced and not given to excessive risk-taking under normal circumstances. And he understood that the British home fleet was somewhere out there, probably in Scupper Flow and possibly already at sea, creating a situation where if British forces intercepted the invasion fleet before it reached Norway, the entire operation would collapse catastrophically. Speed was everything, and surprise was everything in this operation, where timing and coordination across multiple landing sites would determine success or failure. And Hipper and her 4 destroyers sailed north at 25 knots through miserable weather, including fog and rain and heavy seas with visibility less than 2 miles, creating conditions that were perfect for avoiding detection, but terrible for navigation. By midnight on April the 7th, they were 400 miles from Norway and halfway to their objective, with no contact with British forces and the invasion still apparently secret. But then, at 3 o'clock a.m. on April 8th, one of Hipper's lookouts spotted something in the darkness, a ship with low profile and destroyer-sized dimensions crossing ahead at high speed. Hipper's crew went to action stations immediately, but the contact disappeared into the fog before positive identification could be made, leaving High uncertain whether it was British or Norwegian, or possibly just a merchant ship that happened to be in the area. But he couldn't take chances with the entire invasion, depending on maintaining surprise and secrecy. He ordered the 4 troop-carrying destroyers to continue north toward their objective, while he investigated the contact, planning to deal with any threat and then catch up with his charges. And at 8 o'clock a.m. visibility improved slightly to 2 miles and then 3 miles, revealing the same destroyer silhouetted against the grey sea. She was clearly British and appeared to be G-class and was moving southeast, apparently unaware of the German forces in the area. And this was HMS Glowworm, who had absolutely no idea what she had sailed into or that she was about to face the fight of her short life. The story of how Glowworm came to be alone in these waters began on April the 7th at 10:12 p.m. at Scupper Flow in Scotland, where she was part of Destroyer Flotilla 18, attached to the battlecruiser HMS Renown and 4 other destroyers, with their mission being to patrol the waters between Scotland and Norway, watching for German naval movements. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with Force 8 gale conditions and 30-foot seas battering the destroyers. And at 11:30 p.m., Glowworm's lookout reported a man overboard when able seaman Ronald Davis was washed off the deck by a wave, creating an emergency situation where immediate action was required if there was any hope of recovering the sailor from the freezing water. Standard procedure would have been to radio the flagship, requesting permission to break formation and search for the missing sailor. But Lieutenant Commander Roope didn't wait, because every second counted in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and he ordered an immediate turn with full astern to begin search pattern before even informing Renown of his intentions. By the time he finally radioed the flagship, Glowworm was already 2 miles behind the formation and falling further behind with every minute as she searched desperately for Davis, and the search continued for 3 hours, with searchlights sweeping the water and flares being launched and officers scanning with binoculars looking for any sign of the missing sailor. Nothing was found because the sea was too rough and visibility too poor. And able Seaman Davis was gone, lost to the Norwegian Sea, like so many sailors before him who had been claimed by these unforgiving northern waters. And at 2:30 a.m. Roope made the decision to abandon the search and attempt to rejoin the formation, which was now 15 miles ahead. But rejoining proved impossible because the weather had continued to deteriorate and Renown's formation had changed course while Glowworm was searching. And by dawn on April 8th, the destroyer found herself completely alone, somewhere in the Norwegian Sea with no visual or radio contact with her flotilla. Roope made the decision to continue on the patrol route independently, steering northeast toward the Norwegian coast where intelligence suggested German naval activity might be occurring. And at 7:30 a.m., Glowworm's lookouts spotted what appeared to be a destroyer ahead in the fog. Roope increased speed to investigate, assuming this might be one of his flotilla mates who had also become separated. But as Glowworm closed the range, it became clear this was not a British destroyer, but rather a German Z-class destroyer that was significantly larger and more heavily armed than the British vessel. The German destroyer was Z-11 Bernd von Arnim, one of the 4 vessels escorting the troop convoy to Trondheim. And when she spotted Glowworm, she immediately opened fire while turning to interpose herself between the British destroyer and the convoy she was protecting. Roope returned fire, and a brief but intense engagement developed with both destroyers maneuvering at high speed and exchanging gunfire at ranges between 4,000 and 6,000 yards, with Glowworm scoring several hits on the German destroyer, while taking hits herself that caused the damage to her bridge and forward turret that would handicap her in the coming engagement with Admiral Hipper. The German destroyer broke off the engagement after approximately 20 minutes and headed northeast at maximum speed, apparently attempting to rejoin her convoy or possibly to draw the British destroyer into a trap. And Roope followed, maintaining contact because standard doctrine required shadowing enemy vessels and reporting their movements to higher command, even if engaging them directly was inadvisable. He had no way of knowing he was being led directly toward Admiral Hipper, who was investigating reports of a British destroyer in the area, creating a situation where Glowworm was about to encounter a vessel that outclassed her so dramatically that survival would require either extraordinary luck or extraordinary courage. When Admiral Hipper emerged from the fog at 8:47 a.m., the situation's hopelessness became immediately apparent to everyone on Glowworm's bridge because the size difference was so dramatic that the German cruiser appeared to dwarf the British destroyer like an adult towering over a child. Hipper opened fire immediately with her 8-inch main battery, firing full salvos that created massive waterspouts around Glowworm as the destroyer began evasive maneuvers. But the British vessel's reduced speed from earlier damage limited her maneuverability and made it difficult to avoid the incoming fire that was becoming increasingly accurate as German gun crews found the range. Roope returned fire with his functioning guns, though he understood that his 4.7-inch shells could barely scratch Hipper's armor even if they hit, creating a situation where he was essentially throwing pebbles at an armored fortress. But he continued firing because maintaining offensive pressure might force the German cruiser to maneuver in ways that would provide opportunities for escape or possibly for torpedo attack. He attempted to close the range to launch torpedoes, which represented his only realistic hope of inflicting serious damage on the much larger vessel. But Hipper's secondary batteries concentrated their fire on Glowworm as she approached, and the destroyer took multiple hits that started fires and destroyed equipment and killed crew members. The decision to ram rather than attempt escape came from Roope's assessment that Glowworm was already doomed, and that his only remaining option for accomplishing anything useful was to damage the German cruiser in ways that might affect her ability to support the invasion operations. And ramming a cruiser with a destroyer was certainly unconventional and possibly suicidal, but it offered at least some chance of achieving mission objectives, even if it meant sacrificing his ship and likely his own life. The ram itself succeeded beyond what might have been reasonably expected, because Glowworm struck Hipper at nearly optimal angle and speed, creating the 40-meter gash that would require 2 months of repair work and remove the German cruiser from active operations during critical periods of the Norway campaign. The aftermath of the ramming saw Admiral Hipper damaged but still operational, while Glowworm was clearly sinking with her crew abandoning ship into water that was cold enough to kill within minutes even with survival equipment, creating a desperate situation where rescue would need to happen quickly if anyone was going to survive. Captain High faced a difficult decision because international maritime law required rescuing survivors, even enemy survivors, as one of the oldest traditions of the sea. But he had a mission escorting troop transports to Norway, and the invasion was still underway, with every minute of delay putting the operation at risk. And if British warships were nearby, then stopping to rescue survivors would make Hipper a sitting target vulnerable to attack. The rulebook said clearly that he should leave the survivors and complete his mission and radio their position, so someone else could pick them up later. But Helmuth High made a different choice that would define his legacy and demonstrate that honor and humanity could survive even in the midst of total war. He ordered Admiral Hipper to stop and prepare to recover survivors, and for 40 minutes the damaged cruiser sat dead in the water, with scrambling nets over the side and sailors throwing lines and pulling exhausted British sailors from the freezing sea, ultimately recovering 38 men out of the 109 who had gone into the water. Gerard Roope was one of the men pulled aboard Admiral Hipper by a German sailor who hauled him up the scrambling net, and Roope reached the deck and stood despite his wounds and exhaustion, and saluted the German naval ensign before collapsing, demonstrating even in his final moments the naval traditions and military courtesy that transcended national boundaries. German medics took him below and tried to warm him and treat his wounds, but the cold had done too much damage, and his core temperature was too low, and his heart couldn't recover from the hypothermia and trauma. And Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope died aboard Admiral Hipper at approximately 10:15 a.m. on April 8, 1940, approximately 2 hours after ramming the ship that had killed him. The Germans buried Roope at sea with full military honors in a ceremony that demonstrated the respect he had earned even from his enemies, with a British officer being given a funeral conducted by German sailors, including a German honor guard, and the German naval ensign at half-mast, as his body wrapped in the white ensign slid over the side into the Norwegian Sea. Captain High stood at attention during the ceremony, and later wrote in his log that the commanding officer of HMS Glowworm had conducted himself in accordance with the highest traditions of the Royal Navy by engaging a vastly superior enemy without hesitation, and sacrificing his ship to damage the German cruiser, and ensuring his crew had maximum chance of survival before going down with his command, stating that he had seldom witnessed such courage in his entire naval career. Admiral Hipper's damage proved more serious than initial assessments suggested, because the 40-meter gash in her hull couldn't be fully repaired at sea, using the limited facilities and materials available aboard the cruiser. And while she made it to Trondheim, arriving 12 hours late, she had to return to Germany for proper repairs in dockyard facilities, removing her from action for 2 critical months during the Battle of Norway, when her 8-inch guns could have made significant difference in multiple engagements. The 4 destroyers she had been escorting made it to Trondheim and successfully landed their troops, but without Hipper's fire support, They were caught by British destroyers 3 days later in engagements that saw 2 destroyers sunk and 1 damaged with only 1 escaping, demonstrating how Glowworm's sacrifice created cascading effects throughout the German operations. The German invasion of Norway succeeded in its strategic objectives, but cost them dearly with 3 cruisers sunk and 2 cruisers heavily damaged and 10 destroyers lost, representing 36% of Germany's destroyer force destroyed in just 3 weeks of operations. And these losses occurred partly because the Kriegsmarine had to operate without proper intelligence and without air cover and without numerical superiority against British naval forces that controlled the surrounding waters. 1 destroyer alone couldn't stop an invasion, but she could and did slow it down and complicate it, and force improvisation, and create delays that cascaded through the entire operation in ways that provided opportunities for British countermeasures. 6 months after the battle, the letter arrived through the International Red Cross from Captain Helmut High to the British Admiralty, and it was unprecedented because enemy officers simply didn't recommend each other for medals in modern warfare, where such gestures across battle lines were considered inappropriate or even treasonous. But High felt compelled to recognize what he had witnessed. He had watched Roope command his ship under impossible circumstances and seen him attack against overwhelming odds and witnessed the ramming that was either brilliant tactical improvisation or inspired madness depending on perspective. And he had buried the British officer at sea and stood over his body and saluted, and felt the weight of having killed a man who had earned his deepest respect. The letter sat on various desks at the Admiralty for months, being passed from office to office because no one knew what to do with such an unusual recommendation, and there was no precedent for processing it through normal channels. But finally, in 1945, 5 years after the battle, someone made the decision to approve the recommendation, and Gerard Roope was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. The citation recognized his outstanding valor in action against numerically superior enemy forces and his decision to engage Admiral Hipper without hesitation, while continuing the action despite severe damage to his vessel, and when all other offensive capability was exhausted, his choice to ram the enemy at full speed, inflicting damage that removed a major German warship from active service, and his ensuring maximum survival for his crew before going down with his ship in accordance with the highest traditions of the Royal Navy. It was the only Victoria Cross of World War II, awarded on the recommendation of an enemy officer, and it remains one of the most unusual military decorations in British history, where courage was recognized and honored despite coming from someone who had been trying to sink British ships and kill British sailors. In 1960, 20 years after the battle, a British naval historian located Helmut High, living quietly in Hamburg in retirement while teaching maritime history at the university, and when asked why he had recommended Roope for the Victoria Cross, his answer was simple and direct, stating that Roope had earned it and that courage deserved recognition regardless of which flag someone served under. He explained that Gerard Roope did what every naval officer hoped they would do in similar circumstances when he saw an enemy he couldn't defeat, and attacked anyway, not for glory or victory, but because his duty required it. And that kind of courage transcended nationality and deserved recognition from all who witnessed it. He noted that he had spent his career in the Kriegsmarine, serving under a regime he didn't always agree with and following orders he sometimes questioned, but he never questioned the honor of his opponents, and the Royal Navy produced officers like Gerard Roope, who would ram cruisers with destroyers because it was the right thing to do. And that wasn't madness or desperation, but rather the highest form of courage that military service could demonstrate. When asked if he regretted stopping to rescue survivors, given that it delayed his mission and put his ship at risk, High smiled and responded that the mission succeeded anyway, with the invasion proceeding and Norway falling. But if he had left those men in the water and sailed past without stopping, he would have lost something more important than tactical advantage, stating that he would have lost his humanity. He acknowledged that Gerard Roope tried to sink his ship and failed, but earned his respect and the respect of every officer aboard Admiral Hipper. And rescuing Roope's crew was the least they could do to honor courage that deserved recognition even from enemies. The story of HMS Glowworm and Admiral Hipper demonstrates paradoxes that exist in warfare, where enemies respect each other and battles occur where both sides lose, and victories feel like defeats, with the ramming being all of those things simultaneously, as a destroyer charged a cruiser and lost and sank, taking 109 men with her, but damaging the enemy and delaying the invasion, and earning respect from every sailor, British and German, who witnessed the action. The technical specifications of HMS Glowworm reveal a ship that was typical of British G-class destroyers built in the mid-1930s as part of the Royal Navy's modernization program, displacing 1,350 tons at standard load and approximately 1,900 tons at full load, with dimensions of 323 feet length overall and 33 feet beam. Her armament consisted of four 4.7-inch guns in single mounts positioned fore and aft, with 2 forward and 2 aft providing all-around fire coverage, and these guns could fire 15-pound shells to maximum range of approximately 16,000 yards, though effective range against moving targets was considerably less. The 10 torpedo tubes arranged in 2 quintuple mounts represented her most potent anti-ship weapon, because the 21-inch torpedoes carried warheads capable of sinking capital ships if they struck vulnerable areas, though launching torpedoes required closing to ranges where the destroyer would be exposed to devastating fire from larger opponents like Admiral Hipper. The anti-aircraft armament consisted of 2 quadruple pom-pom mounts and several smaller weapons that were adequate for defense against aircraft of the late 1930s, but would prove increasingly inadequate as aircraft performance improved, and the ship carried depth charges for anti-submarine warfare, though this capability was irrelevant to the engagement with Hipper. The propulsion system used 2 Parsons-geared steam turbines, driving 2 shafts and generating 34,000 shaft horsepower from steam provided by 3 Admiralty 3-drum boilers, producing maximum speed of 36 knots that made G-class destroyers among the faster vessels in the Royal Navy, and allowing them to catch most opponents or escape from more powerful enemies when tactical situations required withdrawal. The crew complement of 145 officers and men represented relatively efficient manning for a destroyer of this size, with crew members needing to perform multiple functions and maintain high levels of training to operate the ship effectively under combat conditions, where damage might eliminate key personnel. Admiral Hipper, by contrast, represented a much more substantial investment in naval power as a heavy cruiser designed to commerce raiding and fleet actions, displacing 14,000 tons at standard load and over 18,000 tons at full load, with dimensions of 640 feet length overall and 70 feet beam that made her nearly twice as long and more than twice as wide as Glowworm. Her main armament of 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets positioned in super-firing pairs fore and aft provided devastating firepower against smaller vessels, with each shell weighing 270 pounds and capable of penetrating armor or destroying unarmored targets at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards. The secondary armament included 12 5.9-inch guns in 6 twin mounts, distributed along the sides, providing defense against destroyers and light cruisers. And these weapons proved particularly effective against Glowworm during their engagement, because they could fire rapidly and track small maneuvering targets more easily than the main battery. The armor protection included a 6-inch belt along the waterline protecting vital spaces like magazines and machinery, with deck armor of 2 to 3 inches providing protection against plunging fire and bombs. And this armor meant that Glowworm's 4.7-inch shells could barely scratch Hipper's protected areas even with direct hits. The propulsion system consisted of 3 sets of geared steam turbines generating 132,000 shaft horsepower from 12 high-pressure boilers, providing maximum speed of 32 knots that was slower than Glowworm, but adequate for most tactical situations involving heavy cruisers. And the fuel capacity of nearly 4,000 tons provided operational range of over 6,000 nautical miles, allowing extended operations far from bases. The crew complement of 1,480 officers and men represented substantial investment in training and manning that made losing heavy cruisers particularly painful for navies with limited personnel resources. The tactical situation that developed when these two ships met involved fundamentally mismatched opponents, where every advantage lay with the German cruiser, except for the British destroyer's slightly higher maximum speed that became irrelevant once Glowworm suffered damage, reducing her to 28 knots. The effective range of Hipper's 8-inch guns exceeded that of Glowworm's 4.7-inch weapons by 10,000 yards, meaning the German cruiser could engage at ranges where the British destroyer couldn't effectively return fire. And Hipper's armor meant that even when Glowworm's shells hit, they caused minimal damage, while any hit from Hipper's guns on the unarmored destroyer would cause catastrophic damage. The decision tree that Roope faced when confronting Admiral Hipper involved limited options because attempting to escape seemed futile, given his reduced speed and the poor visibility that made navigation dangerous, while surrendering violated every principle of Royal Navy tradition and would have meant allowing a German cruiser to continue supporting invasion operations without interference. Attacking despite overwhelming odds represented the only choice that offered any possibility of accomplishing mission objectives, even if it meant certain death for himself and his crew, demonstrating the kind of calculated decision-making under pressure that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. The ramming itself required precise ship handling because Glowworm needed to strike Hipper at an angle that would maximize damage to the cruiser while allowing the destroyer's momentum to carry her past rather than becoming entangled. And Roope's execution of this maneuver under fire while his ship was taking damage and his bridge was partially destroyed demonstrated extraordinary seamanship and courage. The impact point on Hipper's starboard side near the waterline proved nearly optimal because it penetrated below the armor belt where the cruiser was more vulnerable and created flooding that couldn't be quickly contained, while striking higher on the hull might have been absorbed by the armored belt with less severe consequences. The damage assessment conducted aboard Admiral Hipper after the ramming revealed the extent of destruction caused by a destroyer striking a cruiser at nearly 30 knots, with the 40-meter gash extending through 3 watertight compartments and creating flooding that threatened to worsen, if not controlled quickly through damage control efforts. The severed electrical systems affected lighting and power distribution throughout portions of the ship, creating cascading failures that required extensive repairs, while ruptured steam lines reduced propulsion efficiency and created hazards for crew members working in affected spaces, where superheated steam could cause fatal injuries. The flooding of 3 compartments added approximately 1,000 tons of water to Hipper's displacement, creating a list that affected stability and required counter-flooding in opposite compartments to maintain level trim, and the loss of this displacement capacity meant the cruiser couldn't carry as much fuel or stores, reducing her operational range and endurance. The structural damage to the hull required dockyard facilities with heavy equipment to repair properly, because field repairs at sea couldn't restore full structural strength. And this necessity forced Hipper's early return to Germany, removing her from Norwegian operations for 2 critical months, when her firepower might have affected multiple engagements. The human cost of the engagement fell heavily on Glowworm's crew, with 71 men killed either during the battle or subsequently in the water, representing nearly half the ship's complement and demonstrating the deadly efficiency of heavy cruiser fire against unarmored destroyers that lack protection against 8-inch shells. The survivors who were pulled from the water by Admiral Hipper's crew suffered from hypothermia and injuries and exhaustion, requiring medical treatment and recovery time before they could be processed as prisoners of war and transferred to camps where they would spend the remainder of the war. The psychological impact on survivors from both ships proved substantial because the British sailors had watched their ship destroyed and their captain killed while being rescued by the enemies who had sunk them, creating complex emotions of gratitude for rescue mixed with grief for lost shipmates and captured status as prisoners. The German sailors who participated in the rescue operation and witnessed Roope's courage and the burial ceremony developed respect for their former opponents that influenced their attitudes toward the war and their enemies, recognizing that courage and honor existed on both sides regardless of political differences between their nations. The strategic context of Operation Weserübung involved German planning that had begun months earlier, when Hitler decided that occupying Norway was essential for securing iron ore supplies from Sweden and denying Britain potential bases from which to threaten German naval operations. The operation required unprecedented coordination between Kriegsmarine surface forces and submarines, and Luftwaffe transport and fighter aircraft and Wehrmacht ground forces, including specialized mountain troops trained for Norwegian terrain, with timing being absolutely critical because simultaneous landings at 6 locations spread across 1,000 miles of coastline had to achieve surprise to succeed before Norwegian and British forces could organize effective resistance. The British response to intelligence indicating German naval movements was hampered by uncertainty about German intentions and limited reconnaissance capabilities that made tracking multiple German task forces simultaneously extremely difficult, with forces like Renown's flotilla being dispatched to patrol likely approach routes without clear knowledge of where German forces actually were or what their objectives might be. The loss of Glowworm meant that British naval headquarters lost a valuable reconnaissance asset that might have provided warning about German strength and dispositions, though her engagement with Hipper did alert British forces that major German operations were underway in Norwegian waters. The cascading effects of Glowworm's action against Admiral Hipper included not just the direct damage to the German cruiser, but also the delays and disruptions to the invasion timetable that created opportunities for British countermeasures, because Hipper's late arrival at Trondheim and subsequent return to Germany for repairs meant that German forces ashore lacked the naval gunfire support they had expected when planning the operation. The loss of 2 destroyers from the convoy Hipper was escorting further complicated German operations by reducing available destroyer strength for other missions, including escorting capital ships and screening U-boat operations and supporting ground forces, demonstrating how individual tactical actions can create strategic effects through complex chains of consequences. The award of the Victoria Cross to Gerard Roope, based on enemy recommendation, represented official recognition that courage transcends national boundaries and that military valor deserves honor regardless of which side demonstrates it, establishing a precedent that influenced subsequent award decisions, though enemy recommendations remained extremely rare throughout military history. The 5-year delay between the action and the award reflected bureaucratic challenges in processing such an unusual recommendation, and also the fact that during wartime, confirming details of actions involving prisoners and enemy forces was difficult when communication between belligerents was limited to international Red Cross channels. The post-war careers of survivors from both ships involved dealing with trauma and loss, while rebuilding lives in societies that were themselves recovering from 6 years of total war, with British survivors returning from prisoner of war camps to find a Britain that had changed substantially during their absence, and German survivors facing the collapse of their nation and occupation by Allied forces. The reunion opportunities that occurred in later decades allowed former enemies to meet again under peaceful circumstances and share memories of the action that had brought them together, with mutual respect replacing the hostilities that had existed during wartime. The historical analysis of the Glowworm Hipper engagement by naval historians and military analysts has produced varying interpretations, ranging from viewing Roope's decision to ram as tactical brilliance that maximized available options to seeing it as desperate measure of last resort that succeeded partly through luck. But most analysts agree that the action demonstrated extraordinary courage, regardless of whether it represented optimal tactics under the circumstances. The question of whether Roope could have escaped by using smoke and fog to break contact remains debated because while his reduced speed made escape difficult, the poor visibility might have provided opportunities if he had prioritized survival over engagement. The ramming tactic itself was relatively rare in World War II naval combat, because improvements in gunnery and torpedoes meant that ships could engage at ranges where ramming was impractical. But historical precedents existed from earlier eras when ramming was standard naval tactic before gunpowder weapons dominated naval warfare. And Roope's employment of ramming in 1940 demonstrated that ancient tactics could still prove effective under appropriate circumstances when modern weapons had been exhausted or proven ineffective. The success of the ram in damaging Admiral Hipper validated the tactic in this specific instance, though it obviously couldn't be recommended as general practice given the near certainty of destroyer loss when ramming vessels as heavily armored as heavy cruisers. The broader lessons about destroyer tactics against superior forces emphasize the importance of using speed and maneuverability to maximize torpedo attack opportunities while minimizing exposure to enemy gunfire, with smoke screens and fog being valuable assets that allowed destroyers to close ranges and launch attacks before withdrawing to positions where enemy heavy guns couldn't engage effectively. The G-class destroyers like Glowworm were designed primarily for fleet screening and anti-submarine work, rather than surface actions against heavy cruisers, meaning they lacked the firepower and protection necessary for such engagements under normal circumstances, though exceptional commanders could sometimes achieve results that exceeded their ship's design capabilities through tactical brilliance and courage. The memory of HMS Glowworm and Gerard Roope lived on through annual memorial ceremonies and veterans associations and historical societies that preserved records and artifacts from the engagement, ensuring that future generations would understand the sacrifice made by 109 men who sailed into battle, knowing the odds were overwhelmingly against them, but fulfilling their duty regardless of personal cost. The example set by Roope influenced training for subsequent generations of Royal Navy officers who studied the engagement as example of leadership under pressure and tactical decision-making when facing impossible situations, with the recognition that sometimes the only honorable choice involves accepting certain death while accomplishing whatever mission objectives remain achievable. In naval warfare, tonnage matters and firepower matters, and armor matters in determining outcomes of engagements. But sometimes courage matters more than material factors, and HMS Glowworm proved that proposition through her final action, with Gerard Roope paying the ultimate price while demonstrating that even hopeless situations can be transformed through extraordinary acts of courage and determination that inspire others across generations and across national boundaries. And his story remains testament to the highest ideals of naval service, where duty and honor transcend self-preservation, and where courage in face of overwhelming odds earns respect even from enemies who fought against such courage.